Our keynote speaker today, Bob Lutz, over nearly half a century in the auto industry, held senior leadership positions at General Motors, BMW, Ford, Chrysler from 1986 to 1998, XI Technologies, before joining General Motors as vice chairman from 2001 to 2010. He is the best-selling author of the original Guts, The 7 Laws of Business, and the updated version 5 years later titled Guts, The 8 Laws of Business, followed by Car Guys versus Bean Counters, and his latest book, Icons and Idiots. He currently lives in the Ann Arbor area. Please welcome our keynote speaker for today, Bob Lutz.
That's the lavalier mic, because unlike some speakers, I like to stay behind the podium where I know what I'm doing, and I don't wander back and forth making gestures. At any rate, thanks very much, Mike. It's a pleasure being here to speak to a group of Chrysler retirees, because I am one myself, and I'll tell you to what point I am one myself. I had a Ford pension from my 12 years at Ford, but my second wife got it. So that one went bye-bye. Then I was on my way to having a really nice pension at General Motors, and Chapter 11 took care of that. So all I got there was the CERP, which was a nice sum of money, but it was paid out equally over 5 years, and it's about coming to an end. The only pension I have that keeps on going, it's the gift that keeps on giving, is the Chrysler pension, which was a major source of income for me for a long time. Of course, Chapter 11 at Chrysler reduced that considerably, but it's still a major source of income. So if somebody says, who's the company that you really retired from, I just look at the dollars and I say it's Chrysler. And a little report from the Detroit Auto Show yesterday, which for the first time I visited, not the first time, but I think today, this last two press days, representing VIA Motors, which converts GM pickups into 40-mile plug-in vehicles. And I also am co-owner of VL Automotive, which is, what would Jesus do? Well, Jesus probably would not rip the electricals out of a Fisker Karma and put in a Corvette ZR1 drivetrain. So it may be the work of the devil, but there's plenty of people out there. We sold 10 of them yesterday at $200,000 a piece. So there is money out there, and we've got a Middle East distributor who basically wants unlimited quantities. The Middle East distributor's only concern is that the car is too cheap, and he wonders if we couldn't get the price by, gold plating some stuff, get it to more like $300,000, because he wants it not to be the car that the sheiks buy for their teenage kids. And what I'm about to tell you sounds very trivial, but as I was wandering around, I drink coffee at various places. The coffee at Nissan was very good. The coffee at Acura was extremely good. The coffee at Mercedes-Benz was imported German Edusel blend, fresh ground for every cup, and then run through the little machine so that you had fresh brewed, fresh ground, premium German coffee, which was off the chart. Now we get to the General Motors stand, which was Aramark coffee. I actually told the GM media relations people, I said, for the assembled media, yes, they look at the cars, but they also get other signals about the focus on excellence of the company. And saving a couple of $100 over Monday and Tuesday, serving lousy coffee to everyone, where for just an insignificant amount of money, you could serve premium coffee that everybody enjoys, to me, is another one of these signals that you're nickel and diming it as opposed to having the focus on excellence. I'm not really sure that anybody understood what I was talking about. But all I can do is report it. I can't influence it anymore. I said, thanks for your input. Thank you for your input. At any rate, thanks a lot for your interest in my new book called Icons and Idiots, and I'll read an excerpt or so. But first I'd like to pass on a few accumulated nuggets of wisdom that I've accumulated over the years, and you've probably learned many of these yourself. But just in case you haven't, here are 10 life lessons that you want to integrate and maybe pass along to your loved ones. The first one is, experience is a wonderful thing. It enables you to recognize a mistake when you make it again. 2, age is a very high price to pay for maturity. 3, by the time you make ends meet, they move the ends. 4, if you have to choose between 2 evils, pick the one you've never tried before. 5, don't worry about what people think. They don't do it very often. And here's one of my favorites. Number 6, going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than standing in a garage makes you a car. 7, artificial intelligence is no match for natural stupidity. And of course, number 8, we've all heard a number of times, and it's true. It's often easier to seek forgiveness than to seek permission. Number 9, which I'm sure that many people agree with, for every action, there is an equal and opposite government program. And number 10, always remember, you are a unique individual, just like everybody else. Anyway, back to Icons and Idiots. It's a study of the leadership characteristics, good, bad, and ugly, of the men I've worked for in my long career and who have influenced me at one time or another in an even longer life. And by the way, when Icons and Idiots first came out and it was reviewed by everybody, and obviously, Mary Barra being in charge of General Motors is a recent phenomenon, but women rising to high positions in the automobile industry is a relatively recent thing. And back when I was coming up through the ranks, there were very, very few women in senior positions. And there were no female drill instructors in charge of male recruits. In fact, there still aren't. But so some of the women reviewers in New York said, this book is an outrage. All of the leaders he talks about are men. What am I supposed to do about that? At any rate, the book includes everyone from a very remarkable high school teacher I had. I was one of his students. I had him from the time I was about 19 until I was 22. I was a late high school graduate, much to the chagrin of my parents, who at some point wondered if I'd ever graduate from high school. But this teacher, this was in Switzerland, in the French part of Switzerland, and this guy was so remarkable that I thought, this is unbelievable that a person of these leadership skills and this communication ability and this profound knowledge of politics and history would sort of peak out at being a high school teacher. Well, 15 years later, he was president of Switzerland, so my assessment of him was correct. I also include my Marine drill instructor and, of course, personalities like Lee Iacocca and Rick Wagner. It's filled with amusing anecdotes. Most of them are PG rated and convey some, I think, valuable leadership lessons that can be applied in the automobile business or any other business. And I'd like to just share a few excerpts with you now. The first one goes right back to my first job in 1963 out of UC Berkeley, which was with General Motors overseas operations in New York. And I was assigned to be a senior analyst in the forward planning department. I never understood the term forward planning as opposed to backward planning. At any rate, my boss was one Bob Wackler, who was director of forward planning. And here's the excerpt. Somehow, somebody had neglected to inform Mr. Bob Wackler that I had been hired into his small, presumably elite team, and this was to make for a stormy welcome. On my first day, I reported to him I was immaculately dressed and ready to impress. I knocked on the open door and a loud, deep voice shouted, "Come on in, goddammit, who the hell told you to knock?" He was a very big man in his early 60s, and he had the beefy, sort of congested appearance of a former wrestler or pro football linebacker who had let himself get out of shape. His hair was close-cropped white. The prominent nose was flanked by pronounced cheekbones, which in turn formed a visual counterpoint to jowls lower down on his massive face. And when he rose, it was clear that his substantial frame was anything but agile. His head moved hardly at all on what passed for a neck. It was more a slightly thinner extension of the torso, blending smoothly into his enormous head. As I walked toward him, he extended a massive hand, easily the size of a medium-weight ham. It grasped mine painfully. "Sit down," he grumped as he plopped himself down in his leather chair and fixed a steely gaze on me from behind the paper-festooned desk. "Look," he began, "I didn't hire you. I don't need you. I wasn't asked. But my boss, Phil Copeland, says I gotta take you, so I will." With that, he shuffled through some papers, retrieved my file, and began to read my resume, rife with business school academic speak, which I had naively assumed would have a killer impact on any future employer. Wrong. Bob Wackler enlightened me with the following. He says, "I've read your fancy friggin' resume about 6 times, and I still don't understand what any of those long words mean. I guess they taught you a lot of newfangled, ultra-modern crap at Berkeley. Well, it ain't gonna do you no good in my department, because when it comes to the way we do business, we're in the goddamn Stone Age. And the best advice I can give you if you want to last more than a week is to forget your fancy education and just Stone Age it along with the rest of us." And with that bit of useful advice, Bob Wackler taught me all I needed to know about how GM operated in those days. But he turned out to be, aside from the physical appearance and the profanity, which he used the most unbelievable profanity in front of his little, 5'2" secretary, a very delicate, frail-looking little lady, and he'd let loose these tirades of 4-letter words, and then he'd say, "Oh, excuse me, my dear." She got to the point where she wasn't even hearing it anymore. But he was, I will tell you this, he was an effective leader. He was one of the people that are relatively rare in large corporations. He was one of the people who actually got things done. You can read more about it, and I hope you will, but let me fast forward a couple of decades to some quick thoughts on one of the most famous CEOs and one of the most effective CEOs ever, and that's Lee Iacocca. Here's the excerpt. Lee Iacocca was at his finest when energized, when there was a crisis, when he had a sense of mission. I kept notes from one executive committee meeting where he, in an unbroken torrent of clear direction, laid out the course of the company for the next few months. It went like this. Okay, so we're bleeding and we can't keep up the incentive spending. Do we give up some market share? I don't know, but if so, how much? We can't give up a lot because we got to keep the finance company in business. Finance has to figure out the optimal point where we maximize profits. I got to tell you, we need urgency here. I hear people say, well, we'll be okay when the LH cars get here. That's like waiting for the senior prom. Let's see what we can do with the old cars. Let's add some value. Can we add standard airbags, free anti-lock brakes? Can we be the safety leader and advertise the hell out of it? Let's see how fast we could incorporate that stuff as standard. Meanwhile, that was Jerry Greenwald, institute a hard hiring freeze. Nobody gets hired. Nobody. Quits and attrition don't get replaced. As for suppliers, accelerate the cost reduction program. We need 5% price reductions. They'll give it to us to keep the business. As for the big cars, you all remember the Dynasty, Fifth Avenue, and Imperial. Yeah, I know. We need a total marketing program. Okay, they're old, but they're great value, and they have a lot of standard stuff. Besides, a lot of older people like that styling. The way we're heading, we won't sell 50,000 units. That's not acceptable. I want to see a plan. And he went on from there. He said, longer term, we've got to look at teaming up with somebody. This game's getting too rough. Somewhere between Volvo, Renault, Fiat, more exports to Europe. There's a strategic answer. We got to stop screwing around and find it. We got to decide what we want out of a tie-up and what we'll give up. So what do we do if the stock keeps going down? Can it go below $10, below $6? It could happen. If we had any cash, we'd buy our own stock and go private. Or we'll up the stock options for the officers. We'll all get plenty of booty when the stock goes up. Remind me to talk to the board. But look, this is an emergency. Pull out all the stops. We got to sell every minivan and every Jeep, every big car, and we have to get the LH on time. I don't like our first half financial projection. It's close to zero. I'm upping it to $500 million. Why? Because that's what I think we should do, and we'll get there. I hope all this is clear because I got it all written down on my list with names behind each one of them. Any questions? Okay, everybody get out of here and get busy. Well, you just couldn't help but admire his focus and the ease with which he verbally, without looking at any papers, rattled off every problem and initiative in front of the company. His energy, optimism, and enthusiasm were infectious. He was able, by the power of his personality, his communication skill, his debating skill, to make one believe things that were manifestly impossible or untrue. It wasn't until later, when you were in the quiet of your own office, you tell yourself, now wait a minute, what I just heard doesn't add up. I was not to be Lee Iacocca's successor. Many on the board thought I should be, but Lee fought it vehemently. I was too ambitious, volatile, unpredictable, undiplomatic, emotional, and way too prone to saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. In short, I was way too much like Iacocca. He instituted what he called the ABL program. ABL stood for anybody but Lutz. Okay, well, I'm sure that some of that stuff brought back some vivid memories for many of you. There's a lot more in the Iacocca chapter that will interest you, I'm sure. But one anecdote, because we were kind of laughing about the Dynasty and the New Yorker and the Imperial, but the Imperial was the ultimate wheelbase extension. You know, a K-car was like when you're at the delicatessen and the butcher rolls out the sausage and he kind of moves the knife and says, how much would you like? Or then he moves the knife 2 inches. It's always the same salami, but you can have it longer or shorter. And the Imperial was, you know, the ultimate 24-inch salami. It was basically a K-car with just length added to it. So when we drove the first prototypes, they were so flexible because the K-car just was never designed to be that long. and they were wobbly, and you'd go over a pothole, and the whole thing would shake for about 10 seconds. And we decided that was unacceptable, so we had to delay introduction or basically re-engineer the chassis or the underbody and put in a lot of reinforcement. And the car was never really what you'd call a stiff car by today's standards. It was, at best, still very flexible in the chassis department. But I was sent out to the West Coast to talk to a so-called Dealer 20 group. This is groups of dealers that are about the same size, that are scattered throughout the area, and the assumption is that because these dealers are more or less out of the same geography and are about the same size of dealership, that they have common interests and therefore would be a good group for Chrysler executives to speak to. And by the way, Ford and GM have similar programs, as do the Japanese. And it's very useful because in that informal setting, you get a lot of good feedback from the dealers. So one dealer said, "So when do we get the Imperial?" I said, "Well, as soon as it's ready, but we did have to reinforce it and that set the program back about 4 months." And the dealer said, "Well, I gotta know because I've got 12 orders for those things," and he says, "and 10 of the customers have died already." Well, anyway, I think the Iacocca chapter obviously will interest you. I've also got one on Bob Eaton. Who, well, now wait a minute. I will say this: Bob was easy for me to work with because basically between myself, Denny, Paulie in manufacturing, Tom Stallkamp in procurement and supply, Tom Gale in design, and Francois Castin in engineering, we basically just did what we want and ran it. And it was basically what we called the Gang of Five that met every day for lunch, and we'd do the product program, the scheduling, the pricing, we did it all. And sort of once a week I went into Bob Eaton's office and told him what we were doing, and he was perfectly happy with that. So it was an easy working relationship. And then he's gotten a lot of criticism for having sold the company to Daimler Chrysler. But I will say, in his defense, it did look like the right thing to do at the time. What happened was that he had been played for a sucker by Jürgen Schrempp, who was the ultimate snake oil salesman. And what happened finally turned out not to be a merger. It turned out to be domination by Daimler, which also would have worked if Daimler had actually gotten in and consolidated the operation and made one company out of two. But instead, they let Chrysler run independently, but with not very good direction. And meanwhile, they were off in Germany running Daimler-Benz. And they applied a lot of pressure, and they told, what's his name, Jim Holden, they said, we want to see another 75,000 minivans sold between now and the end of the year. You've got to do another 50,000 Jeeps. Well, when you issue an edict like that, people start doing stupid things. So they lowered the lease payments, and at one point the Grand Cherokee, which was a wonderfully profitable vehicle, which was generating phenomenal amounts of profits for Chrysler, as long as I was there, I always said, don't go over 20% lease, because if you go over 20% lease, 2 years later, all those cars come back to auction at the same time. You've got an oversupply of 2-year-old used cars. The residuals crash. And so the minute I was out the door and the pressure came on from the Daimler people to sell way more, the lease rate went up to 70%. And 2 years later, you could buy a Grand Cherokee V8 Limited, all-wheel drive, leather, sliding sunroof, the whole 9 yards for $17,000, which with maybe 20,000 miles on it. So just absolutely destroyed the car. So I would say that Daimler mismanaged it. Then Wolfgang Bernhard and Dieter Zetsche came in. I've got a lot of respect for Dieter Zetsche. Wolfgang Bernhard had the wrong view of Chrysler. He believed that since a Mercedes C-Class sells for maybe $5,000 or $6,000 more than a Chrysler Sebring at the time. So he assumed that there must be $4,000 or $5,000 more cost in a Mercedes C-Class than there is in a Chrysler Sebring or Chevy Malibu or whatever. The truth of the matter is there's almost no difference in cost. Where there is a difference is in pricing, because the three-pointed star or the BMW Rondell or the Audi Olympic rings just in people's minds are worth a higher price. But if you look at the hardware, they've all got six-cylinder aluminum four-valve engines. They all have electronically controlled multi-speed transmissions. They all have ABS. They all have traction control. They all have distributorless ignition. They all have four-wheel independent suspension. They all have the same in-car entertainment systems and the same air conditioning systems. And in fact, there probably isn't, if you look at just the material cost, there probably isn't $100 worth of difference between a Chevy Malibu and a BMW 3 Series, or between a Chrysler Sebring and a Mercedes C-Class. But Wolfgang Bernhard wouldn't accept that. So he instituted a cost reduction program on Chryslers and Jeeps that just stripped every last bit of customer visible or customer hearable excellence out of the cars. They became noisy, tinny, hard plastic interiors. All the little chrome bits were replaced with gray plastic and so forth. And then Cerberus bought it. But at the time, what I'm saying is getting back to Bob Eaton, I think Bob Eaton did the right thing at the time. And he was basically executing what Lee Iacocca had talked about years earlier, which was the strategic benefit of hooking up with another global company and getting the synergies and sharing engineering. As it happened, the Daimler guys said, we had a 3.2 V6 engine, 24 valve, et cetera, all aluminum, about, as I recall at the time, about 230 horsepower. Mercedes had the absolute, almost identical 3.2 liter engine. Now, it would make sense to share engines, but Mercedes said, no Chrysler part, because they're so inferior. We will never pollute a Mercedes-Benz by using Chrysler engineering or Chrysler parts. And then, well, how about using Mercedes stuff in Chryslers? What? Our noble components in your cars? What are you thinking? So with that attitude, you never achieve any economies of scale. So you've created the merger, you've created the additional bureaucracy, you've created the additional cost, you've slowed everything down, but on the other hand, you don't consolidate. So Mercedes or Daimler just totally mishandled what could have been a very effective merger. And at the time that we sold it, I mean, let's remember, a CEO's top mission is to create shareholder value. That's just number one. And undeniably, Bob Eaton, by selling the company or merging the company with Daimler Chrysler, or with Daimler-Benz, did create a lot of shareholder value. And he made a lot of people very rich, which later on was forgotten, of course, as the stock went back down again. I thought the absolute low point was and I'm surprised the company lasted as long as it did under the Cerberus management. Bob Nardelli, and I'm not being critical of Italian executives here, especially not in the San Marino Club. But there wasn't a business book written that Bob Nardelli didn't pick up about 8 buzzwords out of. And when you talk to him, all you got was this unbroken stream of latest generation business book buzzwords. And I don't think he said to Rick Wagner and me one time, he said, boy, you know, I've been in a lot of companies, but this car business is rough. He says, why would anybody want to get into this business? And he clearly wasn't capable of handling it. An ill-kept secret is that GM wanted to buy it twice. Once we almost got it before Cerberus got it, and I think that would have been a good deal because the General Motors Chrysler marriage would have made a lot of sense. It was the same geography. We could have consolidated a lot of cost and would have become a very big and powerful automobile company. Unfortunately, Daimler was in it for the money rather than for the strategic value. And they would have gotten a chunk of the equity of the new joint company, but they weren't interested in that. They were interested in maximum revenue right now, and Cerberus provided that. And then towards the end, about early 2008, before the meltdown, and Chrysler was clearly headed for Chapter 11 even without the meltdown, we looked at it again, and we had the product planners sitting together, and here are the architectures we'll share, here's the engines we'll share, here are the plants we'll expand, here are the plants we'll shut down. And we had the whole plan worked out. We identified, Fritz Henderson and I, who was chief financial officer of GM at the time, we, together with Chrysler, identified $11 billion of synergies the first year of putting the two companies together. So Rick Wagner, we explained it all to Rick Wagner. He was on board, and we presented it to the board, and I cannot, to this day, I can't understand why any board member would have refused that deal. And the reason they refused it was, and you have to remember board members spend like 1 day a month on the business, but they said, well, Chrysler has UAW labor, don't they? This is yes, same as we do. Well, why would we pay all this money to get even more UAW labor? And I said, well, of course, you know, all deals have a positive side and a negative side, but with these kinds of synergies, we can live with the UAW labor. No, we're not doubling down on the UAW. Absolutely not. And the deal was basically canceled. So, but for the insight and wisdom of the GM board, this might be a GM Chrysler retirement luncheon. I think, well, and as it happened, I think I'm going to touch on this in a second. I think the way it worked out was just fine. And I think the hookup with a European manufacturer specialized in small architecture, small engines, and small vehicle technology, with the Chrysler end doing the really high margin stuff like Jeeps, Durangos, full-size rear-wheel drive sedans, and of course my all-time favorite, the Dodge Ram, or formerly Dodge, Ram pickup. I never understood that. Why can't the trucks and the cars be of the same brand? I need somebody to explain that one to me. It works for Mercedes, and they do, you know, 80,000 ton 10-cylinder diesel tractor-trailer combinations all the way down to an A-class car, and they're all Mercedes, and nobody worries about it. So at any rate, let's say something that Sergio did that I wouldn't have done. But having said that, I think the company right now, and I've never worked for Sergio, but I have a feeling he's a tough manager. He's logical. He's very strong-willed, which a good senior executive needs to be. I don't think he suffers fools gladly, which again may be cruel in the short term, but it's good for the company. And I think Chrysler has a great pool of talent right now. And I've for instance, the design of the new vehicles is, the Chrysler 200 is what we call perfuming the pig. It was an old design. It was a bad design. It was done during the Nardelli period, and there wasn't enough money to redo everything at once. And I think that Ralph Gilles' team did a terrific job in fixing the front end and fixing the back end. You just don't want to look at the car from the side, but they with the little money they had to sort of spruce it up, and it's done wonders for sales. So it was very well, and of course the imported from Detroit advertising campaign was, I think, one of the most significant, well done, creative advertising pitches ever that connected emotionally with the public, and the car is doing much better than it ever did. I think the new Cherokee is a great piece of work. The Grand Cherokee is sensational, and I think under Ralph Gilles' leadership and design, I think, and with Sergio Marchione's leadership, and with the strategic hookup with Fiat, I really think the company is in excellent shape. Frankly, I think all of the Detroit 3, post Chapter 11 for two of them, are in the best shape that they've been in maybe in 50 years. Because you used to, I was saying this to somebody yesterday, you used to walk around the show like 15 or 20 years ago. And here's all the American cars. They're big, but the paint's grainy, the panels don't fit well, the interiors are shiny plastic, the seat seams are crooked and everything, and carpets are wrinkly, and we say, well, but the American public doesn't care about that. And then you go look at the Japanese stuff and the German cars, and you'd say, open the door and say, wow, look at the craftsmanship and quality of that interior. Look how everything fits. But not just the expensive German stuff, also things like Hondas and Toyotas and so forth. Now you can walk around the show and you go up to any American vehicle of any of the big three. You can look at paint. The cars look like they're made out of glass, colored glass. You open the doors, everything sounds good. The door latch is the potential owner's first handshake with the car. If the door latch feels good and the door opening effort is good, already you've created that first great impression. And look at the interiors of any of the big three cars today in terms of craftsmanship, materials, gloss levels, fit and finish, knob and switch feel. They're easily the equivalent of German cars and quite a bit better than the Japanese stuff now. And you know the old story about, it's apocryphal, I'm sure, but the GM engineers wondered why Toyotas had such tight 3mm body panels and no water leaks. They didn't even do water testing at the end of the line because all the cars were sealed so well. I said, how do you guys do this? And they said, well, actually, what we do is periodically at the end of the line, a car comes off, and instead of water testing and all that stuff, we just put a cat in the car and we leave it overnight. And the next morning when the first shift comes in, if the cat is barely alive and almost asphyxiated, we know that the car is absolutely airtight. And the GM guys decided, boy, that's a good idea. So a GM assembly plant took a Buick Park Avenue off the end of the line, put the cat in it, closed the doors, went home. When the first shift came in the next morning, the cat was gone. But again, those were the bad ideas. Those were the bad old days. I don't know how much time do I have. Okay. Well, that's really the end of my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to take any questions.
What happens to Chrysler if Sergio has a heart attack?
Yeah, that's, did everybody hear the question? What happens to Chrysler if Sergio has a heart attack? First of all, I think that possibility seems to me quite remote because to me he seems like a fairly laid-back individual, and he also seems to be the type of individual who doesn't get heart attacks, he gives heart attacks. So, you know what, I don't know, to be honest, I don't know enough about the executive structure under Sergio. I assume that he can't possibly be doing it all himself, so there have to be some highly capable people at the vice presidential and more senior level who would be capable of taking over. And I'll say something which is personal opinion, but anybody who has read Car Guys versus Bean Counters knows that my firm conviction is in the automobile business, you can't go wrong by putting a car guy in charge, because the car guy will fight for the best possible product with the best possible styling. You say, well, but what about financial controls? I have news for you retired finance gentlemen and ladies out in the audience, but good finance people are a lot easier to find than good car guys. And you can always find a good, tough CFO to stand on the immediate right of the car guy's CEO, who he or she may, want too much or be too ambitious in the forward plans. And then it's good to have the finance person say, wait a minute, let's look at the capital budget. I'm not going to let you do that, and so forth. So for control and guidance, I think the finance people are absolutely vitally necessary, because car guys like me, left uncontrolled, we'd spend the company into oblivion. But to get back to my point, with the little I know about Chrysler right now, and I don't know many of the senior people in it except Sergio, but I don't. If you picked somebody like Ralph Gilles as CEO, I don't think the company would do any worse. So I like Ralph because he's a good designer and a great car guy. So anyway, next question, sir. Yes, sir.
Over here. Yes.
So a little about the electric car and the electric truck and what you think of that market and the potential in the future.
I'm sorry, what's the last part?
Potential for electric.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good question, and it kind of comes up at every talk I give. And I'll say this, I think electric vehicles were way overhyped about 2 or 3 years ago, when President Obama said, I want 1 million on the road in the next couple of years, and the media picked it up, and all the Greens picked it up and said, oh yeah, the revolution is here, everybody's next car is going to be electric, and everybody knew that this was, anybody who understands the business knew that that was manifestly impossible. The reality is, unless you do a vehicle like the Chevy Volt, where it's a plug-in hybrid with 40 to 45 miles electric, and then the small gasoline engine kicks in automatically, drives the generator, and keeps the battery fed for another, doesn't recharge it because that's wasteful, but it maintains it at a minimal level. That way you've got electrification most of the time, but if you want to make a longer trip, you can do it. The trouble with that, so from an electrification standpoint, right now, that's the ideal solution. Problem with it is you've got a duplicative drivetrain. You've got the whole mechanical drivetrain with the piston engine and et cetera, plus you've got an expensive lithium-ion battery and an electric drivetrain. So you either have to price it high to break even or make any money, or you price it low for PR reasons and you lose money. I suspect the latter is true for General Motors right now. In the case of the Via pickups, which will enter production real soon, and the Chevy Express van, for which Via Motors has a ton of orders from FedEx, Coca-Cola, Comcast, et cetera, all for urban delivery, where these big V8 vans get about 11 or 12 miles per gallon. While you incorporate a 50-mile plug-in capability into one of those things, it takes your average mileage to over 100 miles per gallon. And even at $3.25 a gallon, the extra cost for the electrification pays for itself real quickly. Plus the fact that you have no transmission to maintain, engine oil doesn't have to be changed very frequently, brakes don't wear out because you've got regenerative braking, so they feature very, very low maintenance and good resale value. So for a vehicle that pays for itself economically with the fleets, who basically they look at, they're not like the retail customer. The retail customer is probably unwilling to pay an additional $20,000 for a Via electric Silverado as opposed to a normal Silverado. But the fleets look at the cost per mile over the lifetime of the vehicle. And fleets will be very interested in these. So for commercial large vehicles, especially urban delivery, I see a good future. For normal passenger cars, the big problem with electric vehicles right now is limited range. People simply are not comfortable with a vehicle that's advertised as an 80-mile range. But on an extremely cold day, that 80 miles goes to 50 miles. And on an extremely hot day, the 80 miles goes to 50 miles. And a lot of people on the West Coast that are driving Nissan Leafs spend half their lives in a commute in an extremely tense situation, wondering if they're going to get to where they want to go before the charge runs out. So that's just not a way to live. Medium-term lithium-ion batteries are, I think, conservatively going to have 5 times the energy storage capability of today's lithium-ion batteries, which can be used to either keep the same electric mileage and reduce the size and cost of the battery considerably, or the solution I would prefer is keep the size of the battery and multiply today's range by 5. And in the more distant future, like 10 years out, 12 years out, we will have so-called lithium air batteries. Lithium air exists today in a lot of military applications. It's got 10 times the energy density of today's lithium ion. So you think about a Chevy Volt today with 40 miles. With lithium air, that would be 400-mile range. Problem with lithium air is, up to now, nobody has figured out how to recharge it. It's a primary battery, which makes it good for military use. CIA planting bugs in walls of foreign embassies and stuff like that, where you can't get in to change the battery. But lithium air is a way out, and I will tell you, every major university and every government lab around the world is working on advanced batteries. And with that many brilliant minds and with that much funding, you just know that big things are going to happen in just a few years. Now, when the electric vehicle gets to a cost-effective, not Tesla, where you pay $110,000 for the one that goes 280 miles, but let's say priced at no more than today's conventional automobile. And every morning when you wake up, after having left it plugged in, you've got 400 miles in the tank. At that point, I think the electric vehicle will take over. No question, because it's more efficient, it's quiet, it has fewer moving parts, maintenance-free. I mean, it has nothing but advantages. Plus the fact we have a distributed infrastructure all over the world. And for parking garages to put up plugs to where you swipe your credit card and you're automatically billed for the charge. I mean, that's trivial. And we'll see places like Costco put in plug-in stations. You'll see Starbucks have 5 or 6, they'll set up 5 or 6 plug-in things so that while the customer is having her $7 latte, she can get a convenience charge courtesy of Starbucks. So I think the electric vehicle will take over, but it's going to be very gradual. It's going to be a slow climb, and it's not going to be before, I would say, about 2025, 2030, I don't think I'll be alive to see it. Meanwhile, I'll keep driving my Corvette CR1.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Here, way back here.
Where are you?
Right here.
Still no. Oh yeah. Okay. Way in the back. Yeah.
Looking back at the Daimler Chrysler merger, if you were in charge, would you have done the same thing?
Well, the interesting thing was that at the time of the Daimler Chrysler merger, since I'm a native German speaker and was executive vice president of BMW sales and marketing, operating in a German environment in Munich, Germany, I understand the German culture as well as I do the US culture. And I could have served as an intellectual interpreter between the German side and the American side, which was the number one reason for both Bob Eaton and Jürgen Schrempp wanting me the hell out of there as fast as possible. I think I would have been, Bob Eaton was not a strong personality. He was a gentle soul. He was very nice. He was very compliant, and he let Jürgen Schrempp run all over him. I don't think I would have let Jürgen Schrempp run all over me, and I certainly would have put up a very stiff fight. Whether I would have prevailed or not is another question.
We have another one over here, as soon as I get there. Yeah, Mr. Lutz, 30 years ago, nobody would have ever thought China would have been, so big in their exports, and just about everything we're wearing and buying in our houses are Chinese products. Now it looks like, they're taking on a lot of intellectual property from the United States, and because in order to get into China, you have to probably give away your company and your intellectual property rights. How do you think that might affect the U.S. automotive businesses and companies based on like Shanghai and GM giving up their intellectual property rights there, and in China basically in the future and bringing imports and that into the United States?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I actually queered the minivan deal. We were supposed to do a partnership with China when I was still at Chrysler, and we were supposed to put in a facility that initially was going to be in Guangdong. I remember that. Guangdong minivan plant, 50,000 units a year. And I kept meeting with this guy from the automotive ministry, Mr. Liu, and we were negotiating terms and so forth. And one meeting in Beijing, he said to me, well, of course, there's one final detail. We will need all of the intellectual property for the current generation of Chrysler minivans. And I said, well, you mean like uncontrolled? We just give it to the joint venture? And he said, yes. And I said, will there be any limits on the joint venture passing the IP on to third parties? No. I said, so theoretically, we would do the minivan venture in Guangdong, and there would be nothing legally preventing our joint venture partners from selling or licensing our intellectual property to, the Fu Manchu Corporation out in the westernmost portion of China, and they set up another Chrysler minivan plant that we have nothing to do with. I said, well, legally, I suppose that could happen, but it won't. Trust me, it won't. And I said, well, you know what? I don't think we can agree to that. And he said, what do you mean you can't agree with it? I said, we're just not going to do that. And he said, but the rest of the deal looks pretty good, doesn't it? I said, let me tell you the story of what happened at President Lincoln's assassination, where the manager of the theater said to the widow right after the shooting, But other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? So, well, but all joking aside, at GM, I think is very confident that the intellectual property is now controlled by Shanghai Automotive Industries Corporation, who have proven to be an excellent partner, just excellent. Absolutely, you couldn't ask for a better, harder working, more sincere partner. Unlike what I remember from Beijing Jeep, which I also visited a lot during my Chrysler days. They were very difficult to work with. But SAIC is wonderful, and I'll tell you what, General Motors is now always in a tight race with Volkswagen for #1 in China. And it's an extremely profitable market. And as long as you have a big, powerful partner like SAIC, who benefits from the relationship as much as GM does, everything's going to stay under control. And they don't want to disrupt the relationship any more than we do. As far as the power of the Chinese automotive industry is concerned, it's growing rapidly. They're very fast learners, and we know from all the other products they make, it seems like nowadays everything's made in China, but if you look at it, it's always precision built, everything fits, the fit and finish is good, the function is good, whether it's dust busters or blenders, or the stuff they make is good. In fact, I think they are more precision and quality oriented than the Japanese were when we worried so much about the Japanese. So ultimately, the Chinese automobile industry will become a powerful force. The reason I don't think they're going to pose a big threat to the United States is that unlike Korea and unlike Japan, they have a limitless domestic market to expand into. And that's where their sales are. And they're expanding capacity, and they're introducing new models. But they're all for the domestic market. There is no export pressure. Whereas in the case of Japan and Korea, there was a huge pressure to export because their capacity was way, way larger than the domestic market could absorb. As they start getting that domestic market, which is currently at 20 million per year, as it goes to 30 million, 35 million, 40 million, 50 million units a year, at some point they'll start exporting cars. But guess what? By then their salaries and wages will be the same as ours, and it'll be shipping costs will make them uncompetitive in the United States. So I'll tell you, the growth and growing importance of the Chinese automobile industry, if I were the CEO of one of the big three, it's a worry that I would put way, way, way on the back burner.
Do you think Ford's switch to aluminum bodywork will become an industry trend?
I'm sorry?
Do you think that Ford's switch to aluminum bodywork on their trucks?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting, yeah,
trend?
thanks, yeah. The claims are sensational, and they claim that they've taken 700 pounds of weight out. I don't know the weight of the Ram, but I do know the weight of the Silverado and GMC Sierra. Before this model change, Ford was about 300 pounds over a Sierra or a Silverado. With the 700 pounds out, they'd be 400 pounds under, which was, a significant weight saving. Aluminum has a lot of problems. It's hard to stamp, it's hard to weld, it's harder to repair, it's less ding and dent resistant. It's subject to bimetal corrosion if it's butts up against steel or iron someplace. And I'm sure they've engineered for all of that. But it's a costly material, and they're not ready to go with it. For instance, Mark Royce, with whom I exchanged emails yesterday, I said, Mark, are you at all worried about the new F-150? He says, yeah, we are. And I said, well, the ones in the show sure look good. And he said, yeah, well, I had some guys put a magnet onto them. The ones in the show are made out of steel. But I must say, I think it is an incredibly courageous act on the part of Ford Motor Company to take the largest selling vehicle in the United States, the backbone of profitability for the Ford Motor Company, and to take the technological risk of making that vehicle out of a new and unfamiliar material. If I had been in Alan Mullally's shoes, I would have said, you know what, why don't we try it on the Mustang first? That's sort of 80,000 units, and it's a sports car, and it doesn't get the rough usage of people throwing stuff in the bed and denting the tailgate and everything. Why don't we start on the Mustang and do 80,000 aluminum cars a year, and we'll see how that works, and if all that works out, we can then take on the pickup trucks. Nope, they went straight for the pickup trucks. I think it's a huge risk, but it could pay off for them, because I could see, like with the 6-cylinder so-called, EcoBoost engine, and the new 9-speed transmission that's going to be shared with GM, I could see a highway mileage for a full-size pickup truck of 26 to 27 miles per gallon, which would be pretty darn sensational. And it means that Ram and Chevrolet and GMC, who up to now have been saying, yeah, well, that's a rumor, we're not sure it's going to happen, surely they can't do the bed out of aluminum. And the story at GM was, well, they may save 300 pounds, but they're 300 pounds heavier than we are right now. So, and I think the 700 pounds is a big surprise to everybody, and everybody is going to have to rethink. If it all comes out the way Ford wants, and I'm kind of sure it will, because they're too good a company to mess something up like that. If it all comes out the way they're hoping, the other two companies are going to have to rethink their full-size pickups.
Anyone else?
Shall we make this the last one? Okay. My problem is I tend to give a speech every time I answer a question.
This question is from a person listening on our webinar. I'm going to combine two questions. Dimitri asked, do you still fly your own plane? And Ron asked, Bob, tell us about your goal to be the oldest pilot flying a military jet.
Yeah, so I can and I will. I flew my tactical military jet on Sunday, and it was the most frequently asked question at the Detroit show. Are you still flying your former Soviet military fighter? And I said, yes, I am. I flew it on Sunday, because as you'll recall, Sunday was the one nice day that we had. And I have applied to the Guinness Book of World Records, because I do believe that I've checked it out in the U.S. I am in the U.S., and unless there's some retired general in China flying a MiG who is 83 years old, which I sincerely doubt. I know there's nobody in Europe. There's nobody else in the U.S., so I think I will finally convince the Guinness Book of World Records that I am the oldest pilot of a tactical military jet in the world. I just hope they do it before they have to put a little cross behind my name. Thanks very much.